I'm G4, and you're listening to the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading, the exuberantly opinionated atlas of the basic techniques for the world's greatest hobby. This is BGT episode 26, Structures. In this episode, I'll finally go through making structure kits to populate your model railroad's urban form. Hello zusammen! First off, some housekeeping. I'm excited to announce that I have joined and am now provisionally credentialed under the Creator Accountability Network. CAN is a nonprofit dedicated to reducing harassment and abuse through ethical education and a system of restorative accountability. I joined because I care about the safety and well-being of my community members and believe that content creators should be accountable for their actions. If you feel that my content or behavior has harmed someone, please report it to CAN, either via the reporting form on their website at creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org or via their hotline at 617-249-4255. They'll help me and other creators make things right and avoid repeating mistakes in the future. If you're interested in this mission, CAN also needs community volunteers to help with their work, so if you have some skills or time that you think might help, please visit their website to find out how you can contribute. Again, that is creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org. Most importantly, get the word out to other creators who you think would be interested in or need to be credentialed. Let's all build safer communities together. As you may interpolate from how deeply into the BGT feed I've placed it, structure building is something that both I and many other modelers procrastinate on. Some of this comes from legitimate concerns, some less so. For one, earlier on in construction, there is an understandable focus on getting trains up and running. It doesn't matter how good you are at building structures if your layout is effectively static. Going back to the foundational voices in the model railroad press, this hobby is after all model railroading, not railroad modeling. So trains first, structures later. A little later on, there's a bit of a less severe but still noticeable trade-off between structures and scenery. You could work on a signature building, or for much less effort, you could fill in the terrain and quickly paint it brown, sprinkle on some dirt, grow a few trees, and dust on some grass. Though scenery is itself too a procrastinated subject, once that hurdle is over, it takes less effort per square foot, and therefore you can get more of your layout looking more complete for the same time and effort. A building may look nice, but it looks incomplete if placed on a patch of open plaster. A patch of scenic layout lacking a building, however, looks empty, but not incomplete. However, while these are auspiciously logical thought processes, I've had to relearn multiple times that they're insufficient for several reasons. Firstly, there is a phase shift between structure building and previous model railroading steps. Much like scenery, other elements of model railroading involve either massively technical electrical engineering or massively crude swinging around lumber, sheet foam, or plaster until something vaguely starts to resemble a hill. First, you need to conduct a transition to artistic scenery, and now the transition to fine-scale modeling. While fundamentally emotional and therefore logical behavior which should be deleted, it is understandable why many people falter here and sputter at attempts to transcend from a plywood Pacific to a complete-ish model railroad. Even though structure building is closest to the model part of model railroading, for many beginners this is yet another series of techniques you need to learn and yet another series of tools you need to buy. By now, this whole rigmarole may be exhausting, but at least we're here, the end of the marathon is in sight, don't give up yet. Moving on to the more practical reasons to start structures earlier in your modeling process than I've presented in the order on this podcast, making structures involves exorbitant amounts of drying times, both of glues and paint. If the rest of your layout is fully operable, fully scenic, and ready to go, just the simple fact that it takes so long to build a structure compared to scenery will suddenly drag progress to a crawl. Lastly, and most importantly, key structures, such as a station, major trackside building, or a signature, recognizable, identifying layout design element, may influence the construction process itself. If you have a mock-up of the structure, an approximate footprint, or if you're lucky enough, the finished structure, you can test fit it and confirm it works in the scene without needing to remove or reposition track, roads, hills, or other structures, or the supporting benchwork. It's better to know these issues during the benchwork and track laying phase, less better to know it during scenery, and worst to discover conflicts after everything else is down and changes are the most arduous to make. To that point, even though I'm presenting structure building as one of the last stages of layout construction, you really should start much earlier, ideally immediately once your first mainline loop is up and operating. When your construction has progressed to that point, you can head down to the layout room, work on a structure for a few minutes until you have a piece glued and drying, then move on to the rest of the layout to lay or wire a piece of track or plaster a hillside. I'll note here that, with time, expert status is less a secret codex of coveted knowledge and more a modeler learning to intentionally stack projects such that, when they're done at the end of the evening, everything has reached an overnight drying step and work can proceed the next day with maximum efficiency. So, if you're a beginner, here's what I recommend. Once trains are up and running, equip your workbench for modeling and begin building just one structure at a time while you do other things. Maybe start with a simple structure, like a downtown building from a common, easy-to-build kit. Move on to a small yard office or fueling tower, then try a rail-served industry. Maybe once you've gotten some experience, try some larger or signature structures like a roundhouse or station. And finally, as you're plugging along, move from the important buildings out, such that you have the essential structures for a scene first and can fill in the landscape with more generic structures as time progresses and space permits. This should hopefully demystify structure building, give you time to build up your experience for the important things, provide a steady supply of structures to fill out your layout, but not come at too large a time commitment to impede other progress. A final note on structure theory: be very hesitant to buy too many kits at the outset. As Tom Barbalet noted, it's far too common for model railroaders to assemble a home hobby shop of unbuilt kits, or the same kit in triplicate because you forgot you already purchased it. Try your very best to buy the kits only one or two at a time, unless of course Walthers is looking at sponsoring me, in which event buy at least one of every type of structure kit every month until you finally have one built. With all that out of the way, let's move on to the types of kits available. The first and most common type of kit is the plastic kit. You probably remember something like this from childhood, like a plane, boat, starship, or Gundam model you built long ago, probably with great ineptitude. Heh, even Legos are technically a type of plastic kit. Plastic kits are probably the most common because injection molding can easily replicate nearly any shape, texture, or even color, and they're relatively strong and detailed when built properly. However, the reflective sheen of plastics usually easily gives away the material's identity and breaks realism, so they still almost always require painting to look good, even if they're already molded in the desired color. Plastic kits are usually injection molded onto things called sprues, which are conduits for the liquid plastic while it's being cast, but also handy handles when you're painting them. Sprues simply need to be nipped and filed away, as I'll describe shortly. Wood kits are, in contrast, made of the actual material some real buildings are made out of, so they look extremely realistic in how they take paint and weathering. In fact, some can remain completely unpainted, and the color of wood itself may be the desired look. Wood kits typically come in two forms: laser-cut kits and craftsman kits. Laser-cut wood kits aren't too different from plastic kits. They're made from a sheet of usually basswood with a miniature texture on the front depicting board and batten or clapboard-style construction, and as the name implies, a laser then targetedly burns the shape cutouts. Craftsman kits, on the other hand, are sometimes lampooned as being a box of sticks. You get an instruction booklet and a bundle of scale lumber, and you have to cut the boards and beams to size yourself, board by board. While you shouldn't necessarily be scared of craftsman kits, as the name and description implies, especially because it can be meditative to cut and glue boards like real-life construction, just in miniature, and craftsman kits, when done well, are extremely attractive and eye-catching models, I will note that these do take quite a long time and lots of patience and diligence, so they're probably not something you should tackle as long as you consider yourself to be a beginner. Laser-cut kits, though, are simple and distinctive enough that you could probably try making one or two very easily, just as long as you remember that they require slightly different construction strategies from plastic. I'll be covering both plastic and laser-cut kits in a moment. A slowly growing segment of modeling material is paper. While modelers have long made crude stand-in structures by printing out a few walls, pasting them on cardboard or paperboard, and then taping them into a box, some companies now offer downloads of complete detailed structures or wall textures for obscure prototypes. Not necessarily every paper structure has to be flat, as some of these kits encourage you to print on paper of varying thicknesses, or laminate the paper onto paperboard, so that a well-done paper structure isn't automatically less good than a well-done structure of other media, and it's also really appealing to have basically any structure you could wish for right at your printer ink-covered fingertips. That all being said, though, to make a paper kit look well done is probably at least as hard or harder than other kit types, and it's really much more of a scratch build than anything else, so I'd strongly caution the beginner away from using paper kits as anything more than stand-in models, even if the concept sounds appealing. Probably the biggest indictment of paper models is that many people just don't have printers these days. There are also a bunch of other kit types made out of exotic materials such as hydrocal, brass, multimedia, or what have you. While the principles are not too different from any of the techniques you'll learn here, plus or minus a new fancy glue, they're fairly uncommon and just different enough that I'd recommend sticking to the basics, especially for your first layout. Go ahead and try one if you want, but know that your time is probably better spent elsewhere. The last two strategies for building structures are related enough that I'll discuss them together: kit bashing and scratch building. Kit bashing is basically modifying a kit in some way not intended by the original manufacturer. It could be as simple as swapping a door for a window to better make it fit the space, or it could be as complicated as taking two kits and, well, bashing them together into one building. This is usually and deceptively simply accomplished by taking plastic wall pieces, cutting them to the desired shape, and resplicing them together to make a different building. For example, one of my first ever kit bashes was for a club layout, taking a full building and cutting it back to make a backdrop flat. Same structure, same front edge, but much shallower than the full kit could allow. A few nips here and there hide the cutaway points from the aisle, and nobody's the wiser that Lifelike intended it to be 15 centimeters deep, not 2. Scratch building, though, is much more involved. As the name implies, this is building a structure completely from scratch. It's probably easiest in wood, a la a craftsman kit, where all you have to do is just cut a wall frame to size and cover it with boards. Scratch building in plastic is a little more difficult, but in brief, it is usually done by taking sheet styrene with wall textures, cutting them to wall-sized pieces, cutting out windows and doorways, gluing on separately purchased detail parts like window frames and door jambs, and then gluing the walls together with internal supports. All in all, it's not overwhelmingly different from making a plastic kit, but it is involved enough that, again, I'd recommend that beginners steer clear of it for now. If you really wanted, you can probably try to kit bash or scratch build something, as it is much less hard and scary than you'd think and a very useful tool for later in your hobby, but doing it successfully requires you to build up techniques and experience that you should learn first on regular kits. Try it for fun and be pleasantly surprised if you can do it well, but don't build your layout around a supermassive, ultra-detailed megastructure, the absence of which would weigh on you. Now that we've had an overview of the types of structure kits, let's cover the basic tools you'll need to build them. The first and most essential tool is an X-Acto knife, or hobby knife. This is a small pen-sized handle with a replaceable blade. There are different blade shapes depending on your application, but the long, acute triangle one will do for now. You can buy these cheaply at basically any hobby shop checkout counter. Make sure to get extra blades, and if you can, convert an old tiny Tupperware, film canister, medicine bottle, or something of similar size into a sharps container to dispose of old blades in. Something so small and with only a slit to enter that nothing can come back out again, protecting you and others from an inadvertent stabbing when you take out the trash. Regularly test your blade sharpness by cutting a piece of paper, because dull blades lead to sloppy work and injuries. If the paper starts to drag and tear rather than cut cleanly, change the blade immediately and dispose of the old one in your sharps waste. The next most essential tool is one of several good pairs of tweezers, ideally needle-nosed. These are useful for handling or maneuvering small detail pieces or pieces wet with glue or paint. You probably should also have a small pair of pliers as well for similar but larger tasks. You can also get reverse or locking tweezers, where pinching the handle opens the tweezers and the default state is closed and grabbing. These can be particularly useful for dealing with very small details or when you need an extra hand but don't have one. You should also have a pair of nippers or cutting pliers, ideally flush cutting. These will probably be used to clip plastic pieces from their screws. When they become dull, you can mark their handles with a Sharpie indicating such and use them for other cruder tasks like nipping metal wire or rough cutting rails. Once pieces have been nipped from their sprues, you'll need some small jeweler's files to smooth them flush and get rid of any excess burrs or flashing material. I recommend against using sandpaper, and it's useful to have a variety of different grades of files depending on how delicate or recalcitrant the kit material is to filing. That, and I'm certain you'll lose a file or 2, or 3, or 4 over time, as have I. Getting nearer to the end of the tools, you'll need some right angle braces or a magnetic tray. While it is possible to get by without these, you have no idea how useful they are. In effect, these are devices which can hold a pair of walls at a perfect right angle while the glue dries. Not only does it help you to angle your walls with perfect aplomb, it's useful for arranging the walls to be glued, acting as both square and clamp, allowing you to set the drying walls aside without need for being monitored to make sure they don't fall apart while you work on other things. Speaking of, and this is something I hope to expand on later in a model logistics episode, you should also get a ton of cheap wooden trays from your nearest craft store. These can literally be anything from wood to metal to old Tupperwares or baking sheets. What you do is this. When you've worked on a kit enough such that all the pieces are drying with glue and there's nothing more you can do at the moment, pile up all the pieces, instructions, decals, and specialty tools into the tray, pick the whole tray up, and set it aside, giving you space and organizing to pick up another tray to work on a different project. These are deceptively useful devices, as they not only organize which parts go with which, they also allow you to pick up whole projects and move them to the dinner table, in front of the TV, on the porch, organizing not only what you're working on, but also how and where you work on them. Penultimately, and I will admit for the beginner, optionally, is a scale ruler. These are available at practically any model railroading associated hobby shop and have different sized tick marks to measure out feet in all the major scales. It's not a vital tool, but it does allow you to scratch build directly in the true dimensions of a structure, measure track spacing or road lane widths directly from the internet, or easily do forced perspective by measuring something in the background to the same dimensions but a smaller scale. Finally, saving the best for last, besides of course the X-Acto knife, probably the most central part of building a kit is the glue. There are many different types of glues, some with extremely niche purposes, and it can sometimes be a little bit daunting, but probably the three most essential glues you will need as a beginner are thusly. The easiest of the three is wood glue. This is literally the same glue you used for layout construction, just used to make wood kits, though it can easily be put to other applications. Give yourself a small precision-applicated bottle of model wood glue to start, but then refill it later from the larger bottles in your benchwork tool stash. More commonly though, you'll need plastic cement. This is basically a chemical which temporarily melts plastic but then evaporates, leaving the wood glue fused to whatever piece it was next to. A childhood accident spilling a bottle of plastic cement all over kit components led to a Dalian series of walls drooping over the side of table edges and benchtop clutter. So, take my advice and use it sparingly. A little goes a long way. I personally prefer the liquid kind, which is brush applied, not the gel kind, which comes out of the needle-nosed bottles, as I find the latter to be a weaker adhesive. The last and most universal type of glue you'll ever need is cyanoacrylate, or Ca adhesive. This is a very strong and fast polymerizing glue that can link basically any two materials together, but its strength is also its weakness, inasmuch as it's distressingly easy to glue pieces to yourself or the tweezers, and sets so quickly and permanently that it's difficult to adjust pieces precisely. It also leaves behind a crackling whitish residue, which is very difficult to hide, so while it is a powerful tool, it's rarely used on the exterior of models or for small detail parts. There are also several accessory solutions, such as accelerant, which makes Ca dry faster, or uncure, which melts it again to liberate incorrectly glued pieces. When making kits, I'd personally recommend starting with the other two glues based on application, but Ca is an essential part of every modeler's toolbox. The last part of model building, and worthy of a much longer discussion, is painting. There are basically two routes to painting: brushes and airbrushes. Starting with the first, this is probably what everybody is familiar with from childhood arts and crafts. If I had to recommend anything, maybe get one big brush with a flat chisel cut, a medium brush or two of varying shapes, but get a lot more extremely small brushes of very fine points for doing details. Brush care is very simple. Wash the brushes in water immediately after every use, before the paint dries on the bristles. Don't let brushes sit in a vat of water, as that will dissolve the glue holding the brush head to the shaft. However, in probably a departure from most other beginner material, I want to get bad habits out of the way as quickly as possible and encourage you to try airbrushing as soon as you can. I got my first airbrush a few years ago, and it has been absolutely transformative to my modeling. Canned spray paint is no competition, at least for models. Airbrushing is basically using a stream of compressed air and gently feeding paint into the stream, atomizing it, and then distributing it in a thin coat perfectly evenly over the model, no brush strokes to be seen. You can buy airbrushing kits for a couple $100 online, but part of why I'm advising this now for beginners is because Micromark recently came out with a small handheld airbrush with a tiny attached mobile air compressor on its underside for as little as $90. It is now so cheap and simple to airbrush that there are no excuses to not do it from the start. Airbrushing is also deceptively simple. Power up your airbrush, drop a few drops of paint into the airbrush cup, mix a few drops of an appropriate thinner for the paint you're using to the manufacturer's specifications, point, shoot, and then lightly waft a color mist back and forth over the model until it has reached opacity. You will be dumbfounded how simple and easy it is. There are tomes more to be said on airbrush science, but a lot of the basics can be easily intuited from trial and error. There are a few things of note, though, to touch on for beginners. For one, be sure to use a spray booth. Since an airbrush makes an atomized color dust, you'll want to be very wary of overspray coating your prized models or your whole layout in a patina of whatever color you are most recently painting. Cheap, portable spray booths can be bought for less than the cost of the airbrush, and they're basically just a fan which sucks all the air in and filters it out. If you're really, really cheap, just spray into an empty cardboard box. For another, try to avoid touching the models as you're spraying them. This is not just to protect you from the paint, but also to protect the freshly painted models from you getting your fingerprints on them as the paint dries. Try to find a series of soft foam grippers or a small rotating table to hold the models with while you're painting. As far as paint goes, most modelers prefer Vallejo paints because they come in eyedropper bottles, and you can literally use only a drop or two of paint at a time, preventing waste. They even make lines of paints already pre-diluted with flow agent or airbrush accelerant, so no mixing is required. As far as beginnerhood goes, though, I also sometimes use the cheapo acrylic craft store paints if I'm doing very large objects that are not high-quality signature models. Additionally, if you're making a more fancy model with multiple colors, you can easily cover parts with blue painter's masking tape cut with an X-Acto knife to precise shapes and shielding parts of the model from that particular color while you're airbrushing it. Finally, and most importantly, always, always, always clean your airbrush after every use. If there's excess paint in the cup and it dries, you can freeze the needle mechanism and clog your airbrush from diverting paint ever again, making for an extremely expensive replacement. Cleaning isn't too difficult. All you have to do is bring the airbrush and compressor to the sink and run water through it until there's no more paint. A mandatory trick for this is to generate backflow by basically blocking the airbrush nozzle with your finger and forcing the water back through the mechanism and bubbling up into the paint cup, which will do a good job of cleaning all the internal mechanism areas you can't readily access without disassembling the airbrush. When this is done, dry the airbrush decently, and if you're bougie, add a drop of airbrush lubricant to keep it all in good working order. Overall, airbrushing is simpler than you think and leads to fantastic results. If you feel like it's a lot of work, especially to clean, what I do is stack up a bunch of painting projects all at once and get them done in a single evening of painting. But it is a simple, easy step you can take to making fantastic models, and it doesn't have to be done too expensively. Phew! With all of that out of the way, we can actually finally begin assembling structures. For sake of beginnerdom, I will be covering only plastic and laser-cut wood kits. The first part of making any structure is to not touch anything, leave it on the sprue, and paint it before you do anything else. Both plastic kits and wood kits are injection molded or laser cut out of a sheet of material, respectively, and this is useful in two ways. First, it provides a handy handhold to hold and paint the pieces without smudging them with your fingers, and secondly, it means that every piece is separated from every other piece in discrete units of things of the same color trim, which is extremely useful to prevent overpainting the color of one piece onto another with a paintbrush when they're in a completed structure and glued right next to each other. While I fully understand the temptation as a beginner to immediately begin assembling a structure once it's out of the box, and you're fully welcome to do so if you're a straight-up beginner and just don't care, if you are interested in making your structures look decent, keep them on the sprue. Take them to the spray booth and dust airbrush passes of paint onto them until opaque. If the paint is glistening and starts to run, set it aside, let it dry, and paint the rest the next day. For every piece you paint, don't stack anything on top of it to mar the paint's smoothness, and let them dry overnight. Once the paint has dried, you can gently release pieces from their sprue using a sprue nipper for plastic kits or just a few gentle passes of the X-Acto knife for wood kits. Then use an X-Acto knife or jeweler's file with a few gentle passes over the leftover sprue nub until it's flush with the surface. This may necessitate touch-up painting later with a brush, but with the majority of the pieces having been already painted smoothly with an airbrush or a can of spray paint, the touch-up is trivial work. With the pieces liberated from the sprue, follow the instruction for the kit's assembly using either plastic cement or wood glue, or white glue or super glue if you're out of stock of either. Always test fit pieces before applying glue to prevent messy or permanent mistakes, and be very gentle and sparing with your glue applications. If you see excess glue spooging out from the pieces when they're being affixed, you've used too much. Clean it up with a paper towel or your finger. Use your right angle clamps or perhaps a magnetic tray or even rubber bands to hold pieces plumly in place to dry overnight. I also recommend investing in very small clamps, less than 15 centimeters long, to gently clamp smaller parts into place for drying. Slowly, over the course of several nights, your structure will take shape. At critical steps, touch up paint with a small brush where needed, and try to keep drying pieces in a dust-free area to prevent the dust from gluing to the pieces as they dry. Finally, after a week or so's worth of effort, you will have a structure. To wrap up your structure, you'll need to detail it. Go over the completed building and touch up the paint and excess glue spooges with a very fine brush, making sure not to overpaint onto other pieces as best you can. Also, start to add the fine detail pieces that would be damaged during regular construction, such as security cameras, bollards, signs, etc. An important note, most modelers leave important pieces unglued for later integration, namely the roof and base. Leaving the roof unglued allows you to access the interior for later detailing if you want to make shadow boxes visible through the windows or just to show off your modeling cred. Leaving the base unattached allows you to both attach the base to the layout and bring scenery right up to the edge of the building, as well as still remove the building for later detailing or access, such as when adding interior lighting. Actually, on that note, if you plan on adding interior structure lighting later, paint all interior walls black to prevent the light from glowing through the plastic in a transparent haze. An important part of detailing, and one unexpectedly mystifying to beginners, is decals, or decals if you're Canadian, eh? Many kits, especially beginner ones, come with water slide decals for generic business names, window shades, graffiti, advertisements, etc. Given the name, they're actually quite simple, even if structures aren't usually included in most kits. All you have to do is cut the specific decal as close as you can with an X-Acto knife out of a sheet, immerse it in water for 30 or so seconds with tweezers, and then move it over to the structure. The water liberates the decal ink from the rest of the sheet, making it a very thin and delicate film of just pigment, and you can very, very, very gently slide it off the sheet and onto the structure. That's the easy way to do it, though I will note there are several additional more complicated additives by Micromark called Microsol and Microset, which can more readily meld the decal to the surface of the structure, making it look like it's painted on in incredible detail, but this is usually beyond beginnerhood and easy enough to research on your own. The last step of detailing, often eschewed or overlooked by beginners, but a critical part to realism, is to install window glazing. Nearly all structure kits include either sheets or specific cut squares of clear styrene for window glazing, and the ability to see tiny glass in a building's windows is often a subtle but make-or-break element of realism, transforming them from hollow boxes into occupied abodes. To apply glazing, use absolutely nothing but clear adhesive. Crystal Clear, spelled with K's, from Micromark works very well. If you don't use clear adhesive, the glazing will be hazed over in an obscenely unrealistic manner, or worse, etch your fingerprints onto the piece while handling. As with other glues, be very judicious and minimalistic, as you can always add more glue later or re-glue the piece if it falls off, but you can't unglue a great big ol' splotch. When your structure is finally completed, you'll need to affix it to the layout. The easiest way to do this is the simplest but probably least intuitive. If your structure has an attached base, simply place the structure where you want it to go, optionally add a single dollop of glue beneath it, bring the dirt and scenery right up to the edge of the building using spoons and gentle tapping, and affix the dirt per normal using gently applied isopropanol and matte medium. When dry, the excess matte medium and surrounding dirt will provide a perfect seal, holding the building in place but still being removable with minimal effort and hopefully no damage to the structure. If you're even more worried about structure recoverability, you can test fit the structure, mark on the ground where it sits, and bring the scenery up to but not overlapping the structure's position using paper towels or masking tape covering the marked out area. The ultimate methodology for realistic structure integration and recovery is to make a separate stone, styrene, or literal cast concrete base fully integrated into the layout surface, upon which the finished structure can sit without a fixation. This works best on hilly terrain, delicate structures, or hyperrealism, but is probably outside the realm of beginners. Two other methods of note include using magnetic clasps, like the ones on some cabinet doors, or to build a mini module for the structure out of plywood or masonite and then dropping the mini module into a matching shallow hole on the layout. All of these have their uses, but they're mostly non-beginnery ones, and it's really fine just to attach the structure with a single drop of glue and not go back to it for a while. A note on placing structures is to be cognizant of the broader urban planning. While I am certain I will have much more to say about this in the future, the basic tenets agreed upon by all modelers is that you need to include sufficient space for sidewalks, alleys, yards, and just plain negative space. If you look around the real world, especially now, you will be dumbfounded how many empty gravel lots there are. Avoid mashing your structures together tenement style, unless of course you model such as a prototype, and be sure to give your layout the space to breathe. This is another quality worth giving your modeling subject or even local area a walking audit for, but this time specifically observing things like how connected, or not, the sidewalk network is, how far apart the buildings are, etc. Actually, while we're on the subject, it's also worth looking around for street details like benches, parking meters, signs, sheds, pavement markings, fences, junk out back, and basically anything else worth adding to your urban environment to enhance its flavor. I'll probably at some point cover detailing in a future episode, but the simplest way to add details is with hobby tack, a permanently tacky adhesive that allows you to, once dry, stick and unstick figures and details to the layout with merry abandonment reversibly without doing damage. Figures can often be bought in great variety ready to go from your local hobby shop, but if you want something more specific or cheaper bulk options, you can get unpainted cast plastic figures for, say, filling coach seats, or individual 3D printed specialty figures from companies such as Mini Prints or Overland Models. Again, briefly, you can affix figures to a stick for handling them with a dollop of glue, and paint them by hand using a wet artist's palette, mixing paints as you go to make a wider variety of colors than that which can be bought. Facial features can be hinted at with a very light application of a very sharp pencil. With all that out of the way, here are a few final thoughts on structures. As with basically every element of modeling I've discussed thus far, don't be afraid to start. You will get better at building structures the more you build them, so there's no time like the present to start. While you don't necessarily have to fully read the instructions first for every kit you build, you should at least glance over the diagrams and read over sections involving new techniques or complicated procedures. Again, absolutely always test fit pieces dry before gluing them to prevent expensive mistakes. Especially as far as beginnerhood goes, don't be afraid of large structures. In many cases, they simply have larger pieces, and a large building with fewer complicated structural elements can actually be easier to assemble than a smaller building with more complicated features. And finally, one last round of philosophy before we end. In case you haven't noticed by now, since I bring it up practically every BGT episode at this point, I am a strong advocate of trial and error in modeling. The cost of failing at a structure is effectively lower than failing anywhere else on the layout. A terribly built building can act as a temporary stand-in until a better replacement is made, and you can simply take a whole structure and toss it in the trash can without affecting the ability of trains to run successfully. Acclaimed modeler Lance Mindheim amusingly espouses this as the measure once, build twice philosophy of layout construction, and I think it is preternaturally useful for structures. It does take a long time to acquire enough structures to get good at assembling them, but you can easily start out with a bunch of temporary, simpler stand-ins, either ones you made yourself or cheap pre-built ones bought at train shows or secondhand, to populate the layout. Collecting stand-in structures both makes your layout look less empty as you build it, and allows you to gauge what things will look like as you go along. If you're a discerning prototype modeler looking to scratch build distinctive structures, you can make scale-accurate stand-ins out of paper, cardboard, or foam-backed paperboard, often going by the brand name Gatorboard. Then, when your layout is mostly done or ready to go, you can go through and replace the stand-ins one by one with final structures. This strategy has the advantage of both allowing you to test-fit building arrangements as well as making it appear like a more finished product earlier in construction. Furthermore, the ease of swapping out structures allows you to continually go back and refresh scenes to be better as your abilities improve. Unlike track work, which you have to get right before moving on to the next steps, scenery and especially structures are a much more dynamic aspect of the hobby, which can evolve with you and your abilities. As far as beginnerhood goes, it gives you ample, low-stakes opportunity to try your hand at construction, knowing full well you don't have to get it right the first time, or even the first few dozen times. This has been episode 26 of the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading. I hope that with this episode I have helped you to populate your layout with urban elements, bringing life to your towns and closing in on a finished layout. The theme music is Spark of Life by Benjamin Lazarus through Tribe of Noise. I would like to thank my extremely generous and patient patrons Pedro Reyes, Andrew Lavagetta, Ron Kleiss, Bill Ford, Linda Eskin, and Roger Coleman. If you want to join our currently dead Facebook community, you can, but social media run by private companies is exploitative, and you should instead check out Red Note by the government of China, because it's literally an upgrade over American capitalism. Instead, if you have a question or comment, would like to make a donation, or would like to learn more, please visit the show's website at www.bgtmring.org. That's Bravo Golf Tango, Michael Romeo Romeo, Indigo November Golf, Oscar Romeo Golf. If you like the show, please give me a good review on iTunes and subscribe to the podcast feed. If you really like the show, please consider becoming a patron, as it helps me to defer the costs of equipment and website hosting. If you did not like the show, do not say anything and contemplate the thought crime you have committed. This content is provisionally CAN-credentialed, which means that I'm not just woke, I am legally obligated to be woke. You can report instances of harassment, abuse, or other harm to 617-249-4255 or on their website at creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced on the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock tribe. I would like to thank them for their historical stewardship of central Pennsylvania. And now, as your reward for listening through my closing spiel, your modeler's vocabulary word for this episode is bridge hog. Bridge or building carpenter capable of designing and erecting buildings on site, preceding the use of steel and concrete and their associated blueprints. Thank you very much for listening, and happy modeling.